When you spend much time working within the field of philosophy today, you're going to discover that there are a number of different approaches, and these are tied in with historical movements and communities and discourses. They each have their own, you might say, styles and key ways of understanding what the philosophical project is and what it ought to look like. And even if these are not being introduced to you in explicit ways, you're often getting them by the very way that people are presenting materials, looking at topics, having you engage with or not engage with texts and thinkers. And so it's useful to have kind of an overview of what the contemporary scene looks like in academic philosophy. Now, it's not exactly the same as what we could call philosophy, much more broadly speaking, in a popular sense, on the internet, all across the different domains that you could encounter. But academic philosophy is a major driver for that, so it's worth knowing some of these terms and concepts and movements. So I'm going to begin in a way that's actually kind of wrong, but is a useful starting point. A lot of people will divide contemporary philosophy into two main approaches: analytic philosophy, largely associated with English-speaking people, which would include not just the whole Anglosphere of Great Britain and Australia and Canada and the United States and a few other places, but also Scandinavia and people who are working in English in other places. And then there's so-called continental philosophy, continental in this case meaning associated with Europe as a continent, and it primarily signifies philosophy coming out of Germany and France, to a lesser extent Italy, the Czech Republic, Spain, Portugal. There are people doing continental philosophy in the English-speaking areas. There's actually plenty of people doing that. And then there's people doing analytic philosophy in Germany or in France or these places. So it's a little bit blurry and it gets a little bit messy. But that is the way that a lot of people have divided up the world, and there is actually talk of an analytic-continental divide, because what counts as doing philosophy or good philosophy or real philosophy looks very different from these two different sides. And if we're going to generalize, and these are some super sweeping generalizations, analytic philosophy prioritizes clarity of argument, making everything, as logical as possible, focusing in its later part on language, and generally being allergic to engagement with texts and thinkers outside of their little sphere. There is, of course, analytic history of philosophy, so there's analytic Thomism and analytic studies of Hegel and Nietzsche, but they're often not very closely connected with the texts, and that's kind of the analytic shtick. And their view is that philosophy should be more like the sciences, the hard sciences, and try to do all this kind of ground clearing and preparatory work. They spend a lot of time talking about intuitions and definitions and things like that. Now, there's a lot more going on in analytic philosophy than just that. There's analytic feminism and all sorts of cool analyses, for example, recently of what misogyny is by the analytic philosopher Kate Mann in Down Girl. But we'll leave that to the side for the moment. Then we've got continental philosophy. So what is continental philosophy? As opposed to analytic philosophy, which really is a 20th century to 21st century phenomenon, we've got deeper roots in continental philosophy going way back into the 19th and even the 18th century. And it encompasses a whole bunch of different other movements. So German idealism with, Immanuel Kant all the way through Georg Friedrich Wilhelm Hegel and other post-Hegelian thinkers would be part of that. We call that dialectical philosophy. Marx and Marxism, that entire tradition would be part of that. phenomenology, which gets its start with Edmund Husserl and Max Scheler, and then Martin Heidegger and Gabriel Marcel and Edith Stein and those sort of people. Very important movement. Structuralism, which is largely influenced by linguistics and by anthropology. That would be part of that as well. And there's all sorts of other things encompassed in it. Bergsonian vitalism, post-structuralist philosophy, including postmodernist philosophy, which is only a small part of post-structuralism, deconstruction. All of these things fit into continental philosophy, and they tend to be much more focused on, reading texts as wholes and engaging with the traditions. There's often a lot of infighting between them. There's, sort of continental ways of writing and approaching things as opposed to analytic. And so these are two main rival fields, each of which encompasses several different traditions and movements. Now, is that all we've got? No. There's much, much more. So I went to a graduate school that actually specialized in both analytic and continental, and then a third main tradition of philosophy called classical American philosophy. You might think of pragmatism associated with, Charles Sanders Peirce, William James, and John Dewey, all the way up to this guy, Richard Rorty. But there's a lot more to American philosophy than that. There's the entire transcendentalist movement in the early 19th century, which would include quite a few poets, as well as philosophers, and novelists and essayists within that. There's the Puritans, there's what we call the American Renaissance, there's all sorts of other people in between, and there's connections between continental philosophy and American philosophy, because a lot of those American philosophers were connected with Europe, right? And then we can go even further back and we can talk about the history of philosophy. And there are a number of historical movements that have been, in some respects left behind, like British empiricism, continental rationalism. But then there's others that continue forward through today, like Neo-Aristotelianism or modern Stoicism. Those are ancient philosophies that are being brought all the way into the present through reinterpretation. And so one way of doing history of philosophy is precisely that. One great representative of that, Alasdair MacIntyre, who, by the way, trained as an analytic, also was a Marxist, but eventually became an Aristotelian, calls tradition-constituted inquiry and rationality. Another way of doing a history of philosophy is just to focus on the texts and the thinkers and try to figure out what their historical context is and what their teachings actually are without worrying about application to the present. And yet a third way is what we call philosophy as a way of life, associated with the great ancient scholar from France, Pierre Hadot, but it's been practiced in many other ways, involving quite a few important contemporary philosophers like Julia Annas, Martha Nussbaum, my colleague John Sellers, and Chris Gill. All of these sorts of people are involved with that movement. So now it's already getting pretty crowded, isn't it? And notice what we haven't yet talked about. Two other important areas that have some overlap to them. Have we talked about so-called Eastern philosophy yet? No, we haven't. And I don't like the word Eastern philosophy, in part because it implies like there's some sort of essence to the East, which is, what Edward Said rightly calls Orientalism. Chinese philosophy is as vast a field as Western philosophy, and Chinese philosophy is as different from Indian philosophy as it is from Islamic philosophy, which may in fact be part of the West, or might not, depending on how you define things, as they are from Western philosophy. So there are these vast, rich traditions. There are also indigenous ways of philosophy. People have, recently sort of resuscitated Aztec philosophy, for example. A lot of reconstructive work going on there. And there's a special kind of philosophical approach that will often take things from what we typically call Western philosophy and do comparative work with non-Western philosophies. So for example, there are people who specialize in virtue ethics who look at Aristotelian virtue ethics and Confucian virtue ethics and try to find interesting parallels or differences between the two. When we're teaching business ethics, I bring in things from the Confucian tradition or from some Indian philosophers or from some Japanese Buddhist philosophers about what a corporation ought to look like, right? And so that's what we call comparative philosophy. So now we've got analytic, continental, classical American, history of philosophy, including philosophy as a way of life, non-Western philosophies, each of which is its own big world, and comparative philosophy. What else do we have going on? Well, there's also what we can call philosophy of race, class, gender, and disability going on. People who have been marginalized have often had to carve out a space for themselves. So we can think about feminist philosophy itself, a vast variety of different approaches and traditions, as perhaps being another kind of philosophy. Or we can talk about Africana philosophy, which would include African philosophy and also African American philosophy. People like, for example, Frederick Douglass, right? All the way to people in the present day. We can talk about issues of disability. We can talk about all sorts of other matters. And so those constitute other important traditions. And one of the things that you're going to find, there are no neat, tidy borderlands between these. Anybody who tries to tell you that there is either doing that for their own benefit or they're deluded about that. They just don't know the field that well. There's a lot of messy interaction between these different ways of doing philosophy. I'm going to end here by saying one of the upshots of this is you don't have to worry about figuring out the right way to do philosophy. There are many right ways, and they often have things in common with each other. There is no one single path that you have to follow. You can be eclectic and draw upon them. You can build bridges between these different areas or approaches of philosophy. And there's an entire vast world out there for you to explore. Each of these is a legitimate and recognized way of approaching this vast field of philosophy.